So greetings students, today we're going to talk about objects and classes. It's a pretty important concept in Java. So why this is an important concept in Java? Because it is an object-oriented language. So when we say object-oriented language, that means we need to create objects for writing each and every programs in Java. So how do you create objects while we're writing programs in Java? In Java, we have to have a template before creating an object. So what is the template of an object? A class is basically a template of an object. Okay? This is a template of an object. So when I say the word template, what do you know? What do you think when I say the word template? Template means, for example, I'm going to bake some cookies. So I have a recipe for baking cookies. So this is my template. So this is the class for baking cookies. So whenever I create a cookie, that means I bake a cookie, the individual cookies are the objects. Okay? So this is my template and this is my object. So in order to have an object or to create an object, we need to have a recipe. We need to have a template. So what is the template? The template is basically the class. So we're going to talk about creating classes. Before creating objects, we need to specify the template. So how do you write a class? Before writing a class, we need to say, we have to have an access modifier. Then we need to have it followed by the keyword class. The keyword class is used because we're going to define a class. Then we say the class name. A class name is always, it starts with a capital letter. And whenever it has multiple words in it, the second word name also starts with a capital letter. Okay? It starts with a curly brace and ends with a curly brace. This curly brace indicates the body of the class. So now we're going to write a class. We're going to show an example. So for example, I'm going to create a class student. So I'm going to write the access modifier, which could be public or it could be private. We don't need this part because this part is optional when declaring a class. So when we write public, that means the classes outside this class can access it. Okay? They can access it. And when we say private, as you get from the name, the classes outside of this class, they can never access it. So this is a private class. So since this part is optional, we're not going to focus on this part. We're going to move on to the rest of the part. So we're going to define or declare a class which has a name student. So we need to start, we're going to skip this part since this one is optional. We're going to start with the keyword class. Okay? Keyword class. Then we say the name of the class. So what's the name of the class in our case? We have said the name of the class is student. Okay, we start a curly brace and then we have the codes of the class and then we end the class. So this is the body of the class. So what does a class have inside its body? So for this class, inside its body, it should define few things. It should define the fields. So what do you mean by fields? We're going to talk about it later. Okay? Define, we need to define some methods. So why I have commented these things out? Because this is not an actual code. I'm going to give you an idea, an abstract idea of what should be inside a class. So this thing should be present inside a class typically. Okay? So what does a class define? A class defines some states, okay? Some states and some operations of the class. So what are the states? Okay, states are the defining properties. For example, I'm going to give few examples here of states. Okay, states are the defining properties. For example, for a class student, what does it hold? It holds some information of the students, and states are the information that describes some properties of a student. So what are the defining properties of a student? A student can have an ID, it can have a name. So this holds the states of the students for an example class student. So, and then we have to define some methods for our class students. What are the methods that it can have? Method defines the operations that the class can perform. For a student class, what a student can do? A student can study, okay? A student can sleep, he can eat. These are the things that a student can do. So basically this methods that manipulates the states of the student class. So for example, how can it manipulate the state of the student class? So for example, the student class has another state which is weight, okay? Weight. So when I write the method eat, so it basically increases the weight of a student. Increases the weight of a student. So this is how a method performs an operation, and it may or may not manipulate the states of a students. Okay, so once we're done with this part, we're going to move on to defining fields, okay? So in this part, we're going to define the fields of an object. What were the fields? Fields were the states of an object. So for our example case, we talked about a student class. So what could be the states of the student class? We say that the states could be the defining properties like ID, it could be name of a particular student. So we're going to define the fields now. So how do you define the fields? To define the fields, we'll start with the access modifier, like the class name. This one is optional here. It's followed by the data type of the field, okay? And then the name of the field. The field is defining the state. So what could be a state? The state could be a defining property. So for example, here the state could be integer, which holds the ID of the student. It could be a string which holds the name of the students. So to define this state should be a variable. So basically the fields are the variables inside class, okay? So we say access modifier, then we say the data type, and we say the name of the field. Okay, since they're variables, so I say name of a variable. So we know, once again, this part is optional. So this could be public or this could be private. So you know what public and private stands for, but if you don't write down anything, this means that this is default. So this remain default here. So we're going to define the type. What is the data type? The data type is integer for ID. And when we're defining another field which is name, the data type is string. Okay? This is string, and the variable name is name, which holds the name of a specific student here. So this is how we define the fields inside a class. So we define all the fields inside a class. So this should look like the class that we're defining, student, and inside the class the fields are defined here, okay? These are the fields. This is the type how we define fields. So after defining the fields, we're going to define the methods here. Okay? What were the methods? The methods were the operations that the class can perform. For our case, the student class, what are the operations that the student class can perform. So it can do some kind of things like we say, like it could sleep, it could eat, it could study. So how do we write the name of the methods? This, once again, this is the same as the previous one. We write access modifier, then we write return type. A method must have a return type. It should return something. Okay? So for example, the eat method. The eat method should return how many calories the student has eat. So, and then we write down the identifier. The identifier specifies the name of the method. Then it is followed by parentheses. So what does this parentheses holds? This parentheses holds any kind of values that we're going to pass inside the method. So if we pass any kind of values, like parameters, when we pass the values, they're known as parameters. So this is the name of the method. This defines the return type of the methods, and after this it is followed by in parentheses, which defines what are the values that we're passing inside the method. So don't get confused by this part. So I'm going to give you an example. For example, in the student class there is a method. So this part once again is optional. So I'm leaving this part as it is. So I'm not going to focus on this one. I'm going to focus on the rest of the part. So we're going to write a method. So what's the method? The method is add marks. What does this method do? This method adds all the previous marks of the students and generates the final mark, the total mark of the student. So this does a summation, this does an addition, okay? This is what it does. So we're going to write this method. So the return type. What are the return type of this method? This method will perform an addition. It will sum the previous marks of the student, and it will calculate the total mark, and it will return the total mark. So in our case, it will return an integer value which indicates the total marks of the students. So what are the parameters that we're passing here? We're passing here the marks of the students. For example, the marks he obtained in his midterm and the marks that he obtained in final. Okay? This is what we pass. So what happens inside this method? What happens is we calculate the total marks. That means we calculate the sum. The sum is the summation of the previous marks, the mid mark and the final mark, which we have passed as parameters inside the method. These are the parentheses covers the parameters that we have passed inside the method. Okay, we have passed two integers. One is the mid marks and another is the final marks. After adding the two marks, we have stored the summation in this variable, which is typed integer. Then we're going to return these marks to the user. So we write this keyword, which is return. This is a keyword, okay? And then what do we return? We return the sum. So this is a method that we've written. So if we would have written the method which doesn't have a return type, we're going to write down the same method but it shouldn't have a return type. So what we do then, we write void when it doesn't return anything. So I write void, add marks, adds the midterm mark and the final mark. Okay? In that case, this method doesn't return anything. This just prints system.out.println. This just prints the total sum of the previous marks, the sum, mid and final marks. So don't get confused by this part because this method is returning something. So add marks method, it adds two marks and it returns the value of the marks after addition. And this method doesn't return anything. So that's why we have written void part here. Okay? So what's the difference between the two methods? For example, The students, now I'm going to show you an example of a method with no return type. That means a method with a void return type and a method with a different return type. So now let's see a method that we write in each and every program: public, static, void, main. This is the main method that we write in each and every program. So what we write here, so in the main method, this is just an example of a method. What we write here, public, this is the access modifier here, the access modifier. That means the classes outside this class can access this one. And then static, you can ignore it for now. Then void, it means return type is void. It returns nothing, okay? And this part, the string arguments, let's take an array of strings which is named as arguments. So this is the parameter that we're passing here. So let me give you another example that you've seen of a method. So I hope this clears out the confusion of the return type. So let's see another example, like we do this one, like math dot pal, we write 2, 3. What this method does, this method is inside the class math, and this method does a power. This one 2 is the base, this one 3 is the exponent. So it basically calculates the power of 2 cubed and stores the result in double. So that means this method, after calculating the value, it will return a value in double, 8.0. So to store this value, you may write like double x is equal to math.pal 2, 3. This method calculates the value. This is a method that is written inside the math class, and the method, the name is pal. We're passing 2 arguments here, 2 and 3. And after this, when the method performs the code, this method is written in somewhere in the math class, the pal method. So from this method, it returns a value which is a double value, and we store this value here. Okay, so this is the basic differences between a method with a return type of double and the method with a return type of void. Okay, so moving on to the next part. I'll show you in codes later on, so it becomes more clear to you. So I'll try to clear up the confusions later. So now I'm going to show you the concept of objects. So what are the objects? In our regular life, we think about different objects, like a cell phone. This is an object. Then we can think of human is an object. Okay, all of the things that we can think of in our day-to-day life are objects. So after designing a class, for example, a class is written here, which is student. Okay, here we have defined the variables and the methods and everything. So now, as we've done in the previous part, so now we're going to create an object of the class student. So this is the template for the object. This is the design of the object. This defines what are the fields that the object can have and what are the operations that the object can perform. So we're going to create an object. There are 2 parts in creating an object. The first part is known as declare, and the second part is known as instantiation. Okay, so what we do in each part, let's think of declaring integer. Like what we do, integer, this is of type integer. We've declared a variable x, and during the second part, when we initialize a value to it, we write this one, like x is equals to 2. This is what we do. So now for class, we call it instantiation, because we're going to instantiate the object right now. What do you mean by this part? We'll see. Okay, so first we need to declare an object. First we need a data type. So when we're creating an object, what template are we following? We're going to follow the template of student to create a student object. But that means this is our defined type. So I write the type is student. The type is student, like this one, and then This one indicates the name of the variable. So the name of the object. Okay, what is the name of the object? Let's say the name of the object is obj1. So this is same as like declaring an integer value. So let's see. After creating it, now we're going to the instantiation, right? So what we do here, we write obj1 is equal to, we write new. Okay, what do we write? New, we're going to create an object. That means we need to allocate a memory space. Okay, we need to allocate a memory space for that specific object. So what we do, we write the type. What is the type of this one? The type is student. Okay, so now we give a parenthesis. This is just the convention. We'll not focus on this part. This one is called the constructor. This one is called when the object is created. So let's not focus on the parentheses. This is what we have to give when we're creating an object. Okay, so this is similar to declaring an array. Like when we declare an array, and the first part, what we do, we say the data type integer. This will have a collection. This is why we give a third bracket, and then we say array. This is an array of integers. Then what we did, we say array is equal to new. We define the type int, and we define the size. So when we say this word, this means the new keywords, it allocates 5 memory locations for storing the values, storing the integers, and the location, the reference of the location is stored in this variable. So when we're creating an object, we do the very same thing. So let's see what we do. When we say object obj1 is equal to new student, so what we're doing here, we're creating a new memory location. So we're creating a memory location. Suppose this is the memory location that we're creating. This block of memory location will hold the variables of the class. This will hold the fields of the class. So what were the fields of the student class? The fields were name, ID. So all these fields are stored in the specific memory location. So this is now referred by this obj1. obj1 now refers to this object. Okay, so this is very similar to the array declaration and array initialization. So I hope you guys get it. To give you a better idea of this one, we're going to move on with creation of different objects. Let's think of, we're going to create 2 different objects. The first one is student of type 1, of type student. We can do the 2 parts, the declaration and instantiation in the same line. So what we write is student obj1 is equal to new student. Now we've done the 2 lines of code in just one statement. Okay, so now we're allocating a memory location for a student, and this memory location is now referred by this variable obj1. So let's see, in this location, what we have in this memory location, we store the field variables of the class. The field variables are name and ID of this student, which is referred by obj1. So regarding this object, like when this field variables gets created, this field variables gets created when we create an object of the class student. So since this field variables gets created when we're creating a specific object of the class, so that means these are called the instance variables. Why do we call them the instance variables? Because they get created when we create object of that class. Because this is an instance of student class. Okay, this is why these variables are also called instance variables. Okay, these are also called instance variables. So this was not my main focus. I just wanted to let you guys know about it. I'm going to create another object of type student. the next object will be calling this one as obj2 is equals to new student. So now obj2 refers to a new student. Okay, so we in this keyword new, it allocates a memory location for a student object. Okay, and it holds the instance variables of the student objects. So look at it now. This refers to different location where we have a different object of the class student. Okay, and this is now referred by obj2. So obj1 holds the reference of this object and obj2 holds the reference of this object. Okay, so these are two different objects. The instance variables are different for objects obj1 and object obj2. For example, the first student can have a name, John, and can have an ID 10, 20, 30. And the second student can have a name like Rick and have an ID of 10, 40, and 50. So whenever we change the instance variable of this object obj1, this doesn't have any effect on the instance variable of obj2. For example, we're going to change the ID of the first object obj1. We assign it a new ID that is 10, 40, and 60. It doesn't affect on the other object. So this is the concept here. So here we're creating different objects of the class student. So how do we access the instance variable of a specific object? Okay, so you know how we have accessed the methods of the class math. To access the methods of the class math, we write math.pal. So this means go inside the class math, and there you will see a method named pal, and it takes two integer values as parameters. The main point that I wanted to show you here, first I've written the name of the class, math class. Then we've written the name of the method. So after learning the concepts of objects and classes, now we're going to actually declare a class and create objects of it. So before actually declaring a class, I'm creating a class here, like a new. I write a Java class. So what's the name of the class that we're going to design? The name is student. Okay, this class student, this one works as the blueprint or template for the student objects. It should define what are the properties or the fields that a student object may have, and what are the operations that it can have. First, it should declare the fields, that means the properties of this student object, and it should declare the methods, that means the operations that the student object can perform. So what are the fields that we talked about in the previous part of the video? We talked about two fields. One field is of type integer, ID of a student, and another one was of type string, which specifies the name of a particular student. So these are the fields that a student class can have. So now, what are the methods that we talk about? The methods that we talk about in our previous part of the video, like the first method we talked about was add marks. Okay, so it adds the marks of the student, the previous marks of the student. So for defining a method, at first we need to define the return type of a method. So what are the return type of add marks method? It basically adds up the two marks of the student, the midterm mark and the final marks. After adding both the marks, it returns the value of the total mark. It returns the sum of the marks. So it returns a type of integer. Okay, so now after writing add marks, we have to give a curly brace that defines the starting of the method, and this ending curly brace defines the ending of the method. Okay, in this method, are we going to pass any parameters? Yeah, we're going to pass the marks of final and midterm. So mid marks, and we're going to pass the final marks. Okay, these are the two integer values that we're passing inside the method. So what it does a total. Calculate the total marks. It adds up the midterm marks with the final marks. And after calculating the total, it would return the total marks to the student. Okay. So this one here, the return, is a keyword here. Okay. So now we're going to add another method. So let's see another method which doesn't have any return type. For example, the student can study. So this method basically returns nothing. So we specify void as the return type, as it doesn't return anything. And what's the name of the method? The name is study. Okay. Now we start the method and we end the method with another curly brace. So what does this method do? It doesn't return anything. It just prints to the user like system.out.print. Then it prints like the student is studying lectures. Or just say the student is studying now. Okay, this is what it prints. It doesn't return anything. That's why we do not specify the return type here. Okay, since it returns nothing. So after we're done with creating the student class, now we're going to create objects of this class. So in order to create objects of a particular class, we need to create objects inside the main method, the way we have written programs previously. Okay, so in the main method, what we do, we write down the type. So we're going to create objects of student class. So at first what we do, we specify the type. It is of type student, and then we say the name of the object. So let's say the name of the object is obj1, and we say new student. So it basically allocates a memory space, okay, for the particular student object. So moving on to the next part. After creating this one, we want to like access the variables, like means the variables of the student class, like ID, name. So in order to access the variables of the student class, the fields of the student class, we need to write down the name of the class. That means the name of the object that we've created now, obj1. Then we say name. We say name is John. And then we say obj1, and then we define the ID of this specific student object. Let's say ID is 10, 20 and 30. So now once we're done with this part, now we can print name of the student. We have already updated the name here, so we're going to print the name. So we're going to print the name of the student object, obj1 dot name. Okay, so now we're going to implement the method that we've written. You've seen how can we access the members of the student object. So in order to access the method of a student object, we write down the name of the student object, obj1. Then we write down the name of the method. The name of the method was add marks. Okay, so what does this method takes in? This method, we have to pass some parameters to the method. What were the parameters? The parameters were the marks, the midterm marks of the student and the final marks of the student. So at first I say, let's assume the student has obtained 22 in his midterm and he has achieved like 44 in his final. Okay, so this method basically adds the 2 marks and returns the total marks of the students. So I capture, it returns something, right? It returns an integer value, integer. So we specify the value that it returns. We will captured the value in a variable, like it's say int result, and then we run the method, so it calculates the total marks of the student. So now we print system.out.println, let's say the total marks of the student is obj1 result. Okay, this method calculates the result for us. Okay, so now we're going to see the output of this specific program. Let's see. So what it does, at first we have created an object of type student. So for creating this object we followed this template, and then after creating the specific object, what we're going to do, we are going to assign the fields of the student object. The student object has two fields. At first we specified the name of the student object obj1. So how can we access the member? We write down the name of the object and followed by a dot, and then the field that we're going to access. The field is name, so we set the name field to John, and we set the field ID to 10, 20, 30, which is an integer value. Okay, now we're going to print the field, like the name of the student, and we print the field. So the name of the student is John. Okay, and then we calculate the result. In order to calculate the final result, we use the method addMarks. So what does this method addMarks does? It takes in the midterm mark and it takes in the final marks. It adds both marks and returns the summation of the marks. So it returns a type of integer. So we have to catch the value. We catch the integer value in another variable, which is result. So result stores the total marks, which is returned by this method, and after that we print that the total marks of the student is, we're going to print the variable result. So this is the total marks of the student is 66. Okay,